Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me once again Charles Hugh Smith. Charles is the author and proprietor of the popular blog of twominds.com, which he started in 2005, and he's a contributing editor to peakprosperity.com. He is the author of numerous books, including Why Everything is Falling Apart, an unconventional guide to investing in troubled times. He wrote that back in 2013. He's also written several other books. The one that we did talk to him about before was Money and Work Unchained, in which he addresses the idea of universal basic income. And that may be a topic that some politicians are looking at right now, in fact, given the coronavirus and the market carnage that seems to be taking place. Anyway, given the most recent equity comments, equity market meltdown, I should say, and the carnage that's coming about with this coronavirus, I want to talk to Charles maybe first and foremost right now about a recent article, March 16th article, titled COVID-19 Helicopter Money, Go Big Now or Go Home. Welcome, Charles. Thanks for joining me again.
Jay, it's always my pleasure.
It's always good to talk to you, and you are keeping yourself quite a ways away from your other home. Today, I think I'm talking to you in Hawaii. You also have a home around the Bay Area, where we were just a week ago or so for our son's wedding. But the Bay Area is getting hit pretty hard with the coronavirus. And how are things in Hawaii?
Well, so far, Jay, there's fewer cases here, but we don't know whether that's just a result of fewer tests being given, which is the issue in many places in the U.S. We don't know if the number of official cases reflects a lack of testing as opposed to an actual, limited spread of the virus.
Mm-hmm. I guess we don't know this yet, but to what extent does warm weather play in this with this virus? I mean, is it going to be less hospitable in warm environments? And I would imagine that you're living in where you are in Hawaii, the temperatures are generally higher than in the Bay Area, or not?
Yeah, it tends to be in the low 80s here as opposed to the 60s and 70s. But I'm no expert, but I have read that people are looking at Australia as a test case for that theory.
Sure.
Because it is summer there, and it's very hot in a lot of Australia. And we know that the epidemic has spread there, and so therefore there's some concern that heat is not going to suppress it as much as we hoped.
Mm-hmm. Time will tell, I guess. Yes, we can hope, but we have to be realistic as well. So I want to really, COVID-19, helicopter money, go big now or go home. You wrote in that article, governments around the world will be forced to distribute helicopter money to keep people fed and housed and their economies from imploding. Do you see that unwinding now? I mean, I'm seeing some talk about $1,000 checks or something like that from the Trump administration. That's like $330 billion, roughly, I think, if you give $1,000 to every American. But in the meantime, I know the Fed's been pumping in trillions of dollars in the repo market, and they just committed another $1.5 trillion, I think, last week to try to stabilize the markets. They've cut the rates down to zero. Nothing seems to be working, but do you see any signs at all that they're going to do anything on behalf of the masses of people, or is it going to be same old, where Wall Street gets bailed out, the ruling elite are taken care of, but the common folks are left trailing behind?
Well, Jay, that's a very good description of what my fear is, and the hopeful part of that statement is I think we're in a different environment than we were in 2008, which was a financial crisis, as opposed to a healthcare crisis, an economic crisis, a crisis in the real world economy. And so one thing I'm hesitant about, a lot of the commentary I read out there, is people try to compare the current situation to 1929, the Great Depression, or the 2000 dot-com meltdown, or the 2008 subprime global financial crisis. All of those were fundamentally financial crises caused by too much leverage, too much debt, too much speculation, right? Now, we have that exact same setup, which is why we're seeing these huge dislocations in markets around the world. Is there was too much leverage, too much debt, and too much speculation, right? And so that's the perfect setup for a financial dislocation or crisis. But beyond that, this is not just a financial crisis where the Fed can, provide short-term lending and kind of smooth everything over. This is a healthcare crisis, and this is a crisis in the real-world economy, which is why I wanted to talk about helicopter money. Is many of us already know waiters, waitresses, wait staff, people in the tourist industry who were already laid off, right? Even before the lockdown, their hours were being slashed, and I have a deep concern for small businesses, having been, self-employed or in small business myself for decades. It's like the carnage in the small business sector is going to be huge, and just giving people $1,000 isn't going to bail out all the small businesses, many of whom face really high rents. That's another issue I wanted to mention here, is the cost structure of American life has gone up so much that utilities, fees, taxes, rent, it's like incredibly expensive to have a bricks and mortar business. And so I don't think $1,000 per household or per adult is going to really fix the problem for small business. That's one of my concerns.
And I don't know how much that does for, as you point out, just the general living expense. What does $1,000 do in the Bay Area, for example, to pay for your rent? Not much, or in New York City for that matter. Never mind food. How concerned are you about the supply disruptions of food? I mean, Quentin Henning was making the point that in New York City here we may have some issues of even seeing our groceries stocked. Certainly the long-lasting food items have disappeared from the shelves in a couple of days here. But if you had a total lockdown, you might not see trucks coming over the George Washington Bridge to deliver food and so forth. Do you see that as a potential problem?
Well, it's something that we're all monitoring. I think America is blessed in terms of food with a pretty diverse supply chain. Other nations are much more dependent on food from elsewhere. We grow most of our own food, and most of the stuff that's imported is specialty items. And we have a pretty diverse supply chain, of hundreds of, independent trucking companies and railways and so on. So I think we're going to be okay. There may be shortages in some items, but I think it's definitely an issue in other countries which are dependent on global supply chains for their food, and also disruptions that are deeper than the ones we're experiencing. For instance, I saw, this is anecdotal, this was just a report from someone in Thailand who had friends in China. So this is not an official media report I read, but this person was reporting that in rural cities in China there was a huge stench from all the farm animals who had died for lack of feed and care. Yeah. In other words, when you abandon your farms or you're too sick to take care of your animals, then then you can have. So other countries might be experiencing a decline in food production that's going to show up in their economies in a few months.
You wrote in that article that the pandemic crisis isn't going to end in April or May, though the urge to indulge in such magical thinking is powerful. It might still be expanding in August and September. That rings true based on a discussion I had with Dr. Quentin Henning, who I interviewed. That interview can be heard at J. Taylor Media. But Dr. Henning pointed out that time is of the essence. And unless people start quarantining themselves, unless you have mass quarantinings sooner rather than later, because of the exponential growth of this virus, one day adds something like 40% to the number of infections. Is this what you're seeing, that we're not acting soon enough, and that is why this thing could drag on well into the summer and even beyond, or what?
Yeah, I am deeply concerned, and as your interview pointed out, this thing takes off really quickly, and we can look at Italy as the best documented example. The first severe case of the coronavirus occurred in Italy on February 20th, and within 3 weeks, there were thousands of cases, and they locked the country down. Only 3 weeks. That's all it took. And so that is what's different about this from the normal flu or whatever, right? I mean, this thing it advances extremely quickly. I think part of my concern is about it stretching out is I think it's now endemic in much of the world, meaning that there's no way to eradicate it. And so there's a pool of people, of asymptomatic people, people that had mild symptoms or don't even have any symptoms at all, that are going to still be out there. And so when they release these lockdowns and reduce the limitations on movement and enterprise, commerce, then this pool of people will re-enter the mainstream, and there'll be a new wave of infections. And this, we also have to be concerned, and again, I'm not an expert, I'm simply referring to other experts that say that, viruses mutate very quickly. And so we're all kind of assuming that there's not going to be a mutation that takes a turn for the worse, like, for instance, increases the danger to young people, or that it doesn't become even more contagious. Those are unknowns. But I think the economic damage is already so severe.
Oh my goodness!
That we're looking at effects into August, September, October. Even if the coronavirus itself was magically disappeared in a few weeks.
Well, I can't imagine. I mean, I think that the global economy was slowing down a bit anyway. And we've had 10 years of growth here in the U.S., tepid as it may have been, but the equity markets, of course, growing, I think, relatively higher even than the real economy. And so the redistribution of wealth to the top 1/2 of 1% or 1%, it's been very profound. And, of course, a lot of our politics has evolved around that realization that there's just extreme redistribution of wealth. When you say it's imperative to go big now, so you're talking mostly, I guess, from an economic point of view. Do you see revolutions, or you see uprisings among the people? I mean, when people become destitute and they have nothing to lose, isn't that when you start to have real problems in terms of civil disorder?
Exactly, Jay. You said it very concisely, and one of my favorite examples of that is in the French Revolution. The mobs arose and tore down the Bastille, which is considered by many people sort of the start of the uprising, on the day that the price of bread skyrocketed in Paris to the point where people could not afford to eat. Then, as you said, that's what triggers social disorder. I hope and pray that doesn't occur in around the world, but it's certainly the trigger when you feel that you cannot afford to eat or pay your utilities or your rent. Then you are pushed to extremes. And unfortunately, here in the U.S., I'm going to just step back for a minute and try to provide some context. Over the last 20 years, since the .com bubble burst, we've seen an erosion in investment in productivity. And you and I have discussed this in previous shows, that the real source of wealth is greater productivity that is distributed throughout the economy. And of course, this is what the .com bubble was based on, was, my gosh, look at all these tools that are going to increase our productivity.
Yeah.
And so we've underinvested in that kind of thing. I know that you can look at, there's certainly many examples of greater productivity tools being made available, but as a general rule, what's happened is we've invested in stock buybacks and this kind of unproductive stuff. And that created asset bubbles that gave us the illusion of greater wealth, but it wasn't really creating an engine of greater wealth. And then, as you said, because it wasn't really widely distributed productivity gains, it was simply asset bubbles and speculative ventures. Well, then that all flows to the people that have the capital and that can borrow it at very low cost, right? So that's why we've got this huge wealth disparities. And now those bubbles are bursting and all assets are going to be repriced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it would seem so. And, and the small, the common folks are really being left behind once again in a major way. I guess the question is, do you see real prospects then if trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars are spent or created out of nothing? It would seem as though we're going to be facing an inflationary problem of some kind, which unless there's lots of money distributed to the common folks, trillions and trillions of dollars, we're pumping money into Wall Street. I mean, this $1.5 trillion just last week was committed by the Fed. As I said, huge amounts of money that have been pumped in to the markets to try to keep things going the last several months since September of last year. Do you believe that we have a real potential hyperinflation problem, a la the French Revolution? Is that a possibility here? Do you see that at all?
I'm not sure we're going to reach hyperinflation, but I do think it's highly likely that we're going to see inflation kick up for the same reason you said. You pump in trillions into the Wall Street to try to prop it up. That's one thing. But if we do helicopter money, we're not creating the goods and services, but we're creating the money. And so therefore the larger sum of money is going to be chasing what goods and services are still out there. And that's where you get inflation. And of course, you and I have also discussed this in the past, that real world inflation is much higher than the official rate, right? All of us who buy health insurance on our own, we've been hit with, 10, 15% increases year after year after year. So when we're told the official inflation rate is 2%, we can only laugh rather bitterly. So we've already had a lot of inflation in the real world. And so another dose of it could really push a lot of people into insolvency because they can barely afford their living standards right now.
Yeah, it's no question about it. So you have this massive amount of money that's being created, and I think though that if it goes into the hands of individuals, as you say, that will create enormous demand for goods and services without putting. But again, this gets back to your idea of a lack of increase in productivity, where cheap money is available for companies to borrow and buy their stock back. Of course, right now, with things going the way they are around the world, I can't imagine, American Air, all the big airlines, for example, all that, hundreds of billions of dollars, probably billions of dollars at least a day flowing into the banking system is no longer going in there. The illiquidity in the banking system, I can't imagine, Charles, that the ruling elite and the bankers won't be fighting like heck to try to stay alive, and they could care less about the common folks. But again, this gets to this idea when people are desperate. And we've already seen the yellow jackets in France, for example, right? And things haven't. I mean, this was before the outbreak, so there's a lot of reasons to be very concerned about this. Well, I guess we can wring our hands, but we need hope. And so, give us some of that if you can, Charles. What should we be doing, and what do we need to do to literally to stay alive here going forward?
Right. Well, I have a couple of comments on that, Jay. One is, of course, if you have cash or if you can liquidate assets and get out with a little profit and have cash for the repricing of assets, there's going to be some bargains in things like maybe agricultural, agricultural commodities, maybe oil. A lot of things may go on sale here as the speculators have to sell everything. You know, so that's one opportunity. The other thing is, I think it could end up being good for the economy in terms of it finally increasing productivity. Like, for instance, a lot of colleges are closing, and the students have to go online. Well, guess what? That works for probably 80% of all college students. So why the heck do we have to charge people $30,000 a year to stay on a campus, and when actually you can cover 80% of your education online?
Yeah. Interesting.
So we should be able to see some gains there. And what about working from home? Everybody that works in front of a screen, if they can work at home, that's a lot less commuter hours wasted, a lot of fuel that isn't wasted. So I see some gains from the adjustments we're making, if we can institute them.
Well, certainly your idea about commodity prices, that coincides very well with the views of Michael Oliver, who was with us during the first segment of today's show. His view is that we are poised for major gains in the commodities, and I suppose if there's inflation, that would be maybe part of the reason for it. Commodities going up. Well, we're just with a couple of minutes left here. My engineer says 2 minutes, in fact. Just talk to us a little bit about why things are falling apart. In general, the Austrians, people of my ilk, a lot of times like to just look at money, the debasement of currency. And you mentioned about how we're spending our money badly and not building capital and productivity. But just quickly, maybe just summarize your article or your book, Why Things Are Falling Apart.
Okay, thanks, Jay, for that question. Basically, my what I was trying to explain is why our system has become vulnerable to shocks and why it's so fragile. And it's fragile, first off, financially, as you say, in terms of our money. And it's it's economically fragile because we're not investing, and costs have risen and wages are stagnant. But it's also socially fragile for the reasons that we already discussed, that as you undermine the real world economy that 95% of us live in, you create these social instabilities. And then politically, as we all know, the wealthy and the lobbyists control, Washington. And so we're also created a fragility in our political system, that it's no longer functioning. It's not really taking care of or addressing the problems we actually have. It's just putting on window dressing and bailing out Wall Street, and that's not really solving the problem. So all of these fragilities are they're now becoming visible with the coronavirus.
Right. All right. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Charles, for being with us again.